Chapter 9, Miss Lonely Hearts in the Country. Betty came to see Miss Lonely Hearts the next day and every day thereafter. With her she brought soup and boiled chicken for him to eat. He knew that she believed that he did not want to get well, and yet he followed her instructions because he realized that his present sickness was unimportant. It was merely a trick by his body to relieve one more profound. Whenever he mentioned the letters or Christ, she changed the subject to tell long stories about life on a farm. She seemed to think that if he never talked about these things, his body would get well, that if his body got well, everything would be well. He began to realize that there was a definite plan behind her farm talk, but could not guess what it was. When the first day of spring arrived, he felt better. He had already spent more than a week in bed and was anxious to get out. Betty took him for a walk in the zoo, and he was amused by her evident belief in the curative power of animals. She seemed to think that it must steady him to look at a buffalo. He wanted to go back to work, but she made him get strike to extend his sick leave a few days. He was grateful to her and did as she asked. She then told him her plan. Her aunt still owned the farm in Connecticut on which she had been born, and they could go there and camp in the house. She borrowed an old Ford touring car from a friend. They loaded it with food and equipment and started out early one morning. As soon as they reached the outskirts of the city, Betty began to act like an excited child, greeting the trees and grass with delight. After they had passed through New Haven, they came to Branford and turned off the state highway on a dirt road that led to Monkstown. The road went through a wild-looking stretch of woods, and they saw some red squirrels and a partridge. He had to admit, even to himself, that the pale new leaves, shaped and colored like candle flames, were beautiful, and that the air smelled clean and alive. There was a pond on the farm, and they caught sight of it through the trees just before coming to the house. She didn't have the key, so they had to force the door open. The heavy, musty smell of old furniture and wood rot made them cough. He complained that he said that she didn't mind because it wasn't a human smell. She put so much meaning into the word human that he laughed and kissed her. They decided to camp in the kitchen because it was the largest room and the least crowded with old furniture. There were 4 windows and a door, and they opened them all to air the place out. While he unloaded the car, she swept up and made a fire in the stove out of a broken chair. The stove looked like a locomotive and was almost as large, but the chimney drew all right, and she soon had a fire going. He got some water from the well and put it on the stove to boil. When the water was scalding hot, they used it to clean an old mattress that they had found in one of the bedrooms, and then they put the mattress out in the sun to dry. It was almost sundown before Betty would let him stop working. He sat smoking his cigarette while she prepared supper. They had beans, eggs, bread, fruit, and drank 2 cups of coffee apiece. After they had finished eating, there was still some light left, and they went down to look at the pond. They sat close together with their backs against a big oak and watched a heron hunt frogs. Just as they were about to start back, 2 deer and a fawn came down to the water on the opposite side of the pond. The flies were bothering them, and they went into the water and began to feed on the lily pads. Betty accidentally made a noise, and the deer floundered back into the woods. When they returned to the house, it was quite dark. They lit the kerosene lamp that they had brought with them, and then dragged the mattress into the kitchen and made their bed on the floor next to the stove. Before going to bed, they went out on the kitchen porch to smoke a last cigarette. It was very cold, and he had to go back for a blanket. They sat close together, with the blanket wrapped around them. There were plenty of stars. A screech owl made a horrible racket somewhere in the woods, and when it quit, a loon began down on the pond. The crickets made almost as much noise as the loon. Even with the blanket around them, it was cold. They went inside and made a big fire in the stove, using pieces of a hardwood table to make the fire last. They each ate an apple and then put on their pajamas and went to bed. He fondled her, but she said that she was a virgin. He let her alone and went to sleep. He woke up with the sun in his eyes. Betty was already busy at the stove. She sent him down to the pond to wash, and when he got back, breakfast was ready. It consisted of eggs, ham, potatoes, fried apples, bread, and coffee. After breakfast, she worked at making the place more comfortable, and he drove to Monkstown for some fresh fruit in the newspapers. He stopped for gas at the Alcamon garage and told the attendant about the deer. The man said that there was still plenty of deer at the pond because no yids ever went there. He said it wasn't the hunters who drove at the deer, but the yids. He got back to the house in time for lunch, and after eating, they went for a walk in the woods. It was very sad under the trees. Although spring was well advanced, in the deep shade there was nothing but death, rotten leaves, gray and white fungi, and over everything a funereal hush. Later it grew very hot, and they decided to go for a swim. They went in naked. The water was so cold that they could only stay in for a short time. They ran back to the house and took a quick drink of gin, and then sat on a sunny spot on the kitchen porch. Betty was unable to sit still for long. There was nothing to do in the house, so she began to wash the underwear she had worn in the trip up. After she had finished, she rigged a line between two trees. He sat on the porch and watched her work. She had her hair tied up in a checked handkerchief, and otherwise she was completely naked. She looked a little fat, but when she lifted something to the line, all the fat disappeared. Her raised arms pulled her breasts up until they were like pink-tipped thumbs. There was no wind to disturb the pull of the earth. The new green leaves hung straight down and shone in the hot sun like an army of little metal shields. Somewhere in the woods a thrush was singing. Its sound was like that of a flute choked with saliva. Betty stopped with her arms high to listen to the bird. When it was quiet, she turned towards him with a guilty laugh. He blew her a kiss. She caught it with a gesture that was childishly sexual. He vaulted the porch rail and ran to kiss her. As they went down, he smelled the mixture of sweat, soap, and crushed grass. So it's interesting that in this book by Nathaniel West, the most ideal thing one can imagine, like a little paradise, would be to retreat from the world. The only time Miss Lonely Hearts is healthy, meaning not driven crazy by the letters that he receives from others telling him of their problems, or behaviorally going about making decisions that are clearly meant to destroy his life, attacking his boss's wife, nearly raping another woman. The only time that he's balanced and well is when he's with his virginal girlfriend and they've retreated from the world, and the word that she thinks is the most disgusting word of all is human. That she doesn't mind the smell of the cabin, all musty and old, because at least it's not a human smell. As though being involved in the affairs of man and the life of the world is a corrupting thing. If you think of Samuel Beckett's point in Waiting for Godot, or even the movie Return to Paradise, the two of those texts saying jump in and the world is there and engage. And here's a text, Miss Lonely Heart, that says retreat, retreat. The only time you'll be healthy and happy is when you're alone in the woods, cut off from anything that is grossly and contaminately human. Interesting point of view.